Before this video begins, I feel that even though it's been about a month or so since this happened, I should still acknowledge the passing of Stephen Hillenburg and just talk about how much his show truly meant to me. Now you can skip through this if you want and get straight to the video. Here's the time to skip to. But I did want to make a video addressing it when it happened. However, I didn't know what more I could add to what everyone was already saying, and I didn't want to make a quick video about it because I didn't want anyone thinking I was addressing it just for views. But I've always believed that true talent is when you actually go out and find what you're best at and work to improve on it. And Stephen Hillenburg was one of the few people who managed to do that. I mean, it takes a lot to make a revolutionary show like he did, but to be so passionate about it that you would continue to work on it, even when you're sick with an incredibly serious disease, I mean, that's passion for something that I might never understand. To me, that's like a role model. That's someone who should be looked up to. And that's also the crucial piece in a masterpiece. You can have all the talent in the world, but without passion, your show will never be as good as it can be, and you saw that when he left. I mean, that's one of the seasons I'm reviewing, so I do want to state that even though I'm reviewing the low parts of SpongeBob that came about from his absence, I still appreciate the hell out of this show, and I appreciate it even more seeing all the care and skill that Stephen Hillenburg put into it. And I think reviewing this season really shows what happens when the true heart and soul of your show isn't there. But I'm going to close this part off by giving thanks to one of the greatest creators of our time. Thank you for what you left us, Mr. Hillenburg. Now, let's start the review. Now, the last two videos have started and ended with episodes that are either not that good or are just flat out bad. So this will be the first video to start with an actual good episode, Gary in Love. And, amazingly, this one was written by 2 of the 3 writers of the 2 episodes that have gotten 0 so far. One of which, One Course Meal, being its sister episode. So that just enhances my theory that these writers saved their best stuff for their best ideas. This episode, as you can probably guess from the title, is about Gary falling in love with another snail and ending up in a love triangle. Now I think this episode is trying to do what Dumb tried to do by teaching you about the joys and heartbreaks of relationships. But unlike Dumped, which resorts to cheap tactics to get the plot to work, this episode handles it pretty admirably. It shows how love can make you do crazy things, it handles the love triangle aspect in an enjoyable way, and honestly, Gary and this female snail are kind of adorable. And the bully snail has a pretty fun game.
Hey, how come we don't never come through the front, guys?
'Cause bad guys don't never use the front door!
Well, I think that's pretty ridiculous.
And the ending, surprisingly, didn't piss me off as much as I think it should have. I mean, it is kind of out of nowhere and feels a bit shallow, but at the same time, it still captures the heartbreak of losing someone you love in a pretty nice, yet still kind of grown-up way. And does also show that when you do experience heartbreak, it helps to have a friend there to help you get over it. I mean, the older this audience gets, the more they're gonna understand that. And I especially like SpongeBob's portrayal as the concerned pet owner when Gary sneaks out to find his crush. I mean, the way his ignorant moments are handled makes me believe these writers really learned from a pal for Gary. Either that or the third writer is keeping them in check. Don't get me wrong, this episode has its boring moments, like Gary looking for his crush feels dragged out, and the jokes they get from it feel kinda weak. But overall, that's really the only blemish this episode's humor has. Also, I think there was a slightly missed opportunity to make this an episode where Gary actually talks. I mean, it would actually make sense because these bullies can talk, and since they're all snails, I think it would have worked if all of them started using words to communicate. Yet, it sounded like meows with the Bikini Bottomites. I think if they took advantage of that opportunity, this episode would have stood out a bit more, but honestly, that's just a nitpick, and it's still easy to tell what Gary is saying based off the way he's animated. Overall, this is a massive improvement over most of these other episodes, and it's easily one of my favorite episodes of the season. Talk about finding love in a strange place. Next up, we have the Play's the Thing. Now, kind of like SpongeBob's Last Stand, I forgot this episode even existed. And again, like SpongeBob's Last Stand, I understand why after rewatching it. That being said, I do think this episode is better. It's about Squidward having his play rejected by a big play producer, so SpongeBob talks Mr. Krabs into letting him have his play at the Krusty Krab, provided he perform it while working. First off, this is a decent little parody of dinner theater, and I think they were on the right track with this episode. Hell, some of its jokes I can actually see being in pre-movie SpongeBob.
Avast there! What are you all happy about?
I'm on my happy break, Mr. Krabs.
You? I'm used to.
And on top of that, there are moments where this episode could have become a Squidward torture porn, but they do make Squidward a genuine asshole in this episode, so it's actually pretty easy to tolerate his treatment. Hell, also at the end, it has one of the few moments where SpongeBob goes just as crazy as Squidward does, which is actually pretty rare to see. But unfortunately, there is a glaring issue with this episode. Everything else is so lazy and filled with a lot of filler that all the good stuff in it gets completely overshadowed. Squidward's play is the sheer definition of boring. It's nothing but Squidward bitching and moaning about his life. I mean, I get Squidward's life isn't pleasant, but that's because I've seen it so much at this point that I don't need him to dedicate his entire play to reminding me about it. I so wish this play got as much creative focus as Squidward's concert in Suction Cup Symphony got. But no, it's so lazily put together and so stock that it's easy to start toning it out after a while. And him working while performing, that easily could have resulted in some very creative humor. In fact, I would assume this is where they put all their effort into. And SpongeBob's overacting, I can see being more hit or miss because of how over the top he gets. But I personally didn't find it that funny. I guess I can see this episode still hitting well enough with some fans, and when you're comparing it to the rest of the episodes in the season, this one definitely stands up better than most of the others, kinda like Greasy Buffoons in a way. But for me, Greasy Buffoons feels like it hit its top potential. Like, being a hit or miss episode feels like the best that episode could have asked for. But this one feels like it could have been one of the better ones from this season just based off its setup and earlier executions. Like, it had potential to be as good as Gary in Love or The Inside Job, or hell, even I Heart Dancing. But instead, it just got so lazy with its second half that by the end, it turns into an episode that can easily be forgotten. And it's a shame that this episode, like Squidward's play, got swallowed up by its own forgettable nature.
Now, what will we call this eating dinner and watching theater?
Dinner theater? Oh, sure.
And next on the list is Rodeo Days. Now, this is another episode that many people seem to have issues with, and yeah, I certainly have a lot of issues with it too. It's about Sandy going back to Texas for a rodeo, and SpongeBob believing she's in trouble because there are rodeo clowns there. And after absolutely no one gives a damn about Sandy possibly being in trouble, SpongeBob kidnaps all of them and takes them to Texas to save Sandy. First off, this episode is lazy. It's blatantly lazy. The way this episode is structured and paced feels almost as rushed as Stuck in the Ringer. I mean, it takes them till the last minute to reach Texas, and everything before that, like most of these episodes, is ungodly dragged out. Sandy sings a song that goes on for 2 minutes, and it's a very boring song that feels like Texas if you sucked out all the heart and passion that went into it. SpongeBob's reaction to the rodeo clowns is so obviously forced that it's borderline cringy. And of course, there's the issue of messing with the characters' characteristics for no other reason than they had no idea what to do with their plots. I know not many of these characters at this point were besties with Sandy, but they still act unneedlessly cold and uncaring about her, and this would work much better if they acted this way because they knew Sandy wasn't in any real danger and knew SpongeBob was just overreacting. But they know even less than he does, so they just feel too overly uncaring. The humor is also incredibly lazy. They do manage to get one or two jokes that work, but they work in ways that are just so stupid it's hard not to laugh.
I'll get my emergency squirrel rescue kit.
Righto, Mr. Tentacle Sir.
Just don't panic.
Most of the jokes are just boring and too obviously forced that it weighs the episode down even more. And while I don't find myself getting furious with this episode, I can't think of anything worth recommending. It's just yet another unfocused episode from an unfocused season.
I'm indifferent.
Now we move on to Grandma's Secret Recipe, which is yet another imitation Crabs knockoff, like Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy. I mean, don't get me wrong, this episode is 10 times better than Someone's in the Kitchen with Sandy, but I think we all know that's not really saying much. It's about Plankton stealing his grandma's wardrobe and disguising himself as an old lady in order to make SpongeBob think he's his great-great-grandmama, their words not mine, in order to get the secret formula. Now, plus side about this episode is there is a little more substance here. While it's mostly trying to get humor from old people stereotypes, it does manage to get some variety with them. Like, they actually use these stereotypes for multiple different situations, which makes it slightly less lazy than some of the other episodes, since it does give off the feeling that they are actually trying. That being said, it is still lazy. Even though they are getting decent setups every now and then, the jokes almost always seem to fall flat, and that's not exactly good for an episode that's clearly trying to rely on its jokes, as opposed to its story. I mean, every now and then they get a decent joke, like the ratio of Plankton and the other Bikini Bottomites, for example, when Plankton is visiting his grandma. But then they botch it up again with jokes that clearly had little thought put into them.
5 minutes until bedtime, Mr. Plankton.
Well, Grandma, that's the sweetest, most tender...
5 minutes, Mr. Plankton.
I heard you the first time!
Oh, isn't that funny? She said 5 minutes twice, and it annoyed him. Again, I get they're making fun of the fact that some nurses can be complete sticklers like this, but again, it's completely bone-dry humor. And after seeing so much of this already, this just gets more and more obnoxious the more they rely on it. Also, let's talk about Plankton's plan, because I understand it. It's centered around the stereotype that no one can say no to an old lady. That's fine. In fact, that could have been a promising little plot device. But it still feels off here. Even when he imagines it, it seems off.
You wouldn't want me to be up all night with painful bloating, would you?
Goodness, no. Here you are.
Dude, have you met Krabs? This guy throws old ladies out for the almighty dollar. And yes, I know, continuity is non-existent, except when it isn't in this show. So, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt that this is a joke that relies on the audience knowing Mr. Krabs would never do this. But there's other stupid jokes like this that really don't make any sense.
Oh, I had the most horrible dream of my life! I was dressed up as... Holy Mother of Neptune, it's true.
See, this show could have benefited greatly if they went a different route with this episode. If this episode was like The Inside Job and had Plankton slowly losing his memory because he was wearing his grandma's stuff for too long or was acting like a grandma for too long, they could have gotten much more variety out of this episode and probably opened up a lot of fun joke possibilities. But instead, this is really the only joke of its kind from this episode, which makes it feel not only out of place, but desperate. And yeah, they make SpongeBob incredibly stupid again, but it's more a bland kind of stupid instead of an infuriating kind of stupid, so I guess that's an improvement. But overall, this episode is one that relies too much on stupid, desperate jokes and doesn't know how to use its stereotypes. And I think it's safe to say these imitation Crab knockoffs are really starting to get old.
Why didn't I think of this before? No one can say no to a helpless little grandma.
Oh, real nice. You forgot to edit out the wig on the grandma's head.
Oops.
And next we have The Scent of Money, which I believe fully to be one of the 2 episodes the writers of Pet Sitter Pat used as a blueprint. The other one clearly being A Pal for Gary, which would only make sense because 2 of the 3 writers of both those episodes wrote this one as well. And yes, that is clearly not a flattering comparison to give this episode. It's about Mr. Krabs finding out Gary has a power for attracting coins, and uses him to get as much change as he can. All to the obvious discomfort of Gary, and the complete ignorance of SpongeBob. Now, unlike Pet Sitter Pat and A Pal for Gary, there are some positive things here. First off, I do think the last part of this episode is genuinely good. I mean, once they get to the arcade, the episode becomes enjoyable to me. SpongeBob telling off Mr. Krabs for his abuse of Gary is actually a bigger step up than most of his portrayals in this season. Mr. Krabs' punishment is actually good. And believe it or not, I do find it humorous when Mr. Krabs dresses up as a pregnant lady.
Oh boy, it sure is hard being pregnant.
Yeah.
But this episode's biggest flaw is one that basically weighs the entire episode down, keeping it from being a good one. It's too reliant on Gary suffering at the hands of Krabs. Now again, because they did have a decent punishment for Krabs, this at least doesn't get anchored down to the bottom dwellers for me, because they did fix the biggest issue with similar episodes like this. And they don't make SpongeBob feel entirely like a villain himself, despite his ignorance. But this is still uncreative and gets old after a while. Watching Mr. Krabs use Gary as a coin magnet gets old once they leave the Krusty Krab. I mean, when they're at the Krusty Krab, they actually manage to get passable humor out of it.
Looks like I need pockets for me pockets.
But once they start going through the city, it just wears out fast and becomes boring to sit through. With the only difference being Gary looking more and more uncomfortable and scared. And even when SpongeBob realizes what's going on, it doesn't really click with the episode. I mean, SpongeBob finds out what Mr. Krabs is doing after this guy, you know, the dude who eats nails without any milk from No Weenies Allowed, tells him about it. Yet, he doesn't realize it when he sees Mr. Krabs with a bag full of money and Gary looking at him like this. I don't know, if SpongeBob's gonna be that ignorant, it feels suddenly out of character that a guy SpongeBob doesn't even know telling him what's going on suddenly makes him realize everything. Like, if you're gonna have it go like this, don't even have SpongeBob see anything that's going on. Make Krabs legitimately diabolical, and have him keep SpongeBob from actually seeing everything, so it doesn't feel like a cop-out. I mean, this is a perfect reason to make Mr. Krabs go full villain, because it's a situation where his greed should be impossible to control. Now, I know Krabs is technically the villain in this episode, but he's not a good villain. He's not actually doing anything creative to get away. He just has the easiest opponent in the world. The reason he gets away with anything he does is because SpongeBob is too dense to see what's happening, even when it literally smacks him in the face. And I can tell once again, they're trying to get humor out of making SpongeBob so stupid, but they don't understand how to make that funny. They just keep thinking they have to change up the situation for it to work. And the situations most of the time aren't even the problem. It's the execution that's ruining this joke. Now, while I still think this episode is better than some of the others from this season, it's still not a good episode. It has moments where a good episode could have arisen, and moments where they clearly did have an understanding of how to make this type of humor work. But once again, the 11-minute runtime proved too much for them, so they weighed it down with poor, repetitive humor and sporadic writing of SpongeBob. To me, this is the very definition of an episode that's so close, yet so far.
What do you mean you don't feel so good? You look fine to me.
Now we move on to The Monster Who Came to Bikini Bottom. Now, in my last seasonal review, I said I was going to double the points that specials get, since they have double the runtime. But apparently, not all specials from this show are above 15 minutes, as apparently The Curse of Bikini Bottom was a Halloween special, and the next 6 episodes I'll be talking about are all part of the Legends of Bikini Bottom, which is an anthology special. So I'm rewriting that rule to be for only episodes that exceed 15 minutes. Sorry, I didn't realize this show had so many episodes that are technically specials. It's actually kind of fascinating. Anyway, this episode is about Patrick accidentally creating a coral monster and befriending it. But when he takes it into town to meet SpongeBob, the police try to keep the monster contained. So this is yet another episode that I think has a really bad pacing problem. Now the first 3 minutes are actually fine. They set up why Patrick bonds with the monster, and I think they do it pretty well. But once Patrick takes the monster into town, all bets are off. After that, it resorts to the typical first draft feeling, throwing shit to the wall and keeping whatever sticks and whatever doesn't type of writing that has ruined so many of this season's episodes. SpongeBob flip-flops from being afraid of the monster to being quote-unquote friends with the monster pretty lazily. The monster doing monster-like things is incredibly forced, which is amazing because I don't think I've ever seen a monster episode actually have to force its monster to act like a monster before. The police are just a big time waster. They're either showing up and looking incredibly bored, like they themselves don't want to be in this episode, or they're making fun of Squidward for his house getting destroyed.
And what's so funny?
Oh, the thought of anyone living in a pile of gravel.
You know, I'm starting to think Squidward has a thing for cop wives, because all the cops in the city seem to enjoy his suffering way too much. And when the monster finally does go into the city, absolutely nothing comes out of it. By the end of the episode, I felt like I had watched a bunch of random clips from SpongeBob episodes on YouTube. It was that poorly put together. Also, the humor? Yeah, the humor has way more miss moments than hit moments. Now, some of the humor in the beginning is pretty decent, especially the part with the snow globe. It drags on a bit, but it's still got a charm to it. But after that, the humor is so obviously unthought out that it almost feels like 5th graders wrote this episode. I mean, one perfect example of how lazy the jokes are is this joke where SpongeBob overreacts to a broken ice machine. Hell, now I feel bad for criticizing Greasy Buffoon's lazy jokes. These are way worse. And what's interesting is this joke ends up actually playing a role at the end, but they made it unnecessarily long. While this isn't by any means the worst episode of the season, like I said, it does have a nice start to it. It's just one of those episodes that goes downhill so fast, and honestly, it's hard not to get the sense that the writers were starting to get another bout of burnout here. To put it simply, this episode is a monstrous bore.
He's escaped!
Anyway, next we have Welcome to the Bikini Bottom Triangle, which is about the majority of the main cast getting sucked into a deserted island by the magic of mermaids. And I won't lie, I think it's a pretty unique little portrayal of the famous Bermuda Triangle. What makes it so interesting is that it's working its concept around the stereotypical teenage girl who gets bored of everything so fast.
Love this mirror, girls, but it is so 10 minutes ago.
Like, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, like, all this stuff is old news.
And it's kind of a different take on excessive shopping, so to speak, which I'm honestly surprised they managed to make work so well. Like, you wouldn't expect these things to go hand in hand, but they kind of found a way to make it flow in this episode. Also, the humor in this is a pretty big improvement over the monster who came to Bikini Bottom. It's more energized, it's more creative. Hell, it even remembered Patrick's mermaid fetish from the first SpongeBob movie.
You go ahead, SpongeBob. I'm gonna hang with the ladies for a bit.
It's a magical bag of winds. I stole them from my father.
You're hot.
But at the same time, you could argue that's just them trying to keep continuity. Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't do that with a straight face. This season caring about continuity.
How cheesy.
I also like this creepy old captain guy here. I mean, I think he actually does add to the atmosphere of the triangle, and I like the little twist they do with him at the end. But one thing I do want to discuss about this episode is the mermaids, because I think they can be one of those elements that ruins the episode for some people, since they're so stuck up and one-dimensional. But maybe it's because I've been so bombarded by lazy and/or infuriating writing from this season that I kind of give this episode a pass for their betrayal, since it's not really either of those things. Though, I do admit Pearl's little tantrum was absolutely stupid and annoying. But even then, I did like how they worked in using that to teach the mermaids about the mall. I guess there's also not that much real substance to this. I mean, they don't really do a whole lot with this island of people stuff thing, but I think it's entertaining enough. It's got some memorable moments in it, and it's an overall fine episode. And I'm happy to welcome it to the slightly above average club. Trust me, that's pretty impressive for this season.
T-N-O-P, Grandpa.
Tina.
Totally not our problem.
And with that, we move on to the Curse of the Hex. I think I see what connects all these anthology stories together. They all have great titles that give you the wrong impression that the episode will be better than it actually is. This episode is about a... Oh, God!
I see you're hungry, but...
Do I even need to comment on that design? Do I? Nope. Yeah, everyone saw it? Yeah. Okay, good, just checking. It's about a hagfish gypsy cursing the Krusty Krab after Mr. Krabs refuses her service. And as a result, the Krusty Krab loses all of its customers. Now, of all the episodes in this anthology, this is one of the better episodes, but that's not really a compliment. First off, yes, that hagfish is one of the most hideous designs I've ever seen from the show. One of. And the episode's adventure is really rushed. Now, I give them some credit for trying to make a decent adventure here, but the pacing is horrible. Like, the first half of it is just the setup for her to curse the Krusty Krab. Really, the episode doesn't even get to the curse until almost 6 minutes in. And it spends the first half just fucking around with the hagfish's gross design and these dragged out weather jokes, as well as has a completely obvious time filler when SpongeBob tries to sneak Krabby Patties to the hagfish. But the second half explores the curse, has Mr. Krabs trying to cut a deal with the hagfish, and the hagfish sending them on a task to retrieve a doubloon from the belly of a giant eel. So think about it. The episode has 5 minutes to work in those 3 plot devices. How do you think they turned out? The curse is brushed over, the hagfish chat has very little substance to it, and the fight with the giant eel is literally a joke. Like, this is how SpongeBob defeats it.
Take this!
And that pisses me off because those plot devices are actually interesting. And despite being rushed, they still hold my attention very well. They could have just had this hagfish curse the Krusty Krab in the first minute and spent the next 10 developing all of these. But, at the very least, this episode never hits boring territory for me. It still gets some decent jokes and has some creative moments with its curse. And I really like the zinger the hagfish gives Krabs at the end when the curse is lifted.
That's the curse?
You think I'm going to waste good spells on a bottom feeder like you?
But yeah, that's really all I have to say. Well, I really think there was a big missed opportunity here. I guess the finished product is enough to at least keep your attention for 11 minutes, so I guess in the end, it does its job. Like I said, it's not exactly high praise for one of this anthology's best efforts.
Come on, boys, spit it out! Okay, let's see what's under the hood.
Now we move on to the main drain, and just like A Day Without Tears, this is another episode I think people think of when they try to write the show off as just a kid's show. It's about Mr. Krabs telling SpongeBob and Patrick about the main drain to the ocean, and how 2 kids pulled it, resulting in the destruction of Bikini Bottom. So SpongeBob and Patrick set out to find it. Hey, how about that? They really are psychopaths. Don't worry, I'm joking. They set out to find it because they're not sure if it's real, which makes sense since it's been revealed that Mr. Krabs always tells fish stories. But aside from that, there's really not that much to go over. It's just a basic kids episode. The humor is very dry, the plot is completely dragged out, but there's really not that much that'll piss you off, except for maybe the ending depending on how you look at it. It's revealed that Mr. Krabs and Plankton were the ones who pulled the main drain, which, if you watch the episode all the way through, you kinda already figure out at that point, since both of them are very paranoid about the other two finding it. And Patrick pulls it. Then it's revealed the whole episode was a story SpongeBob was reading to Patrick. Which, for the record, you could end any episode with and it'll fit. It's a literal throw this in so the episode will hit 11 minutes tool. I'm sorry, I'm really trying my best to give this a proper analogy, but there's really nothing to analyze. Honestly, most of the stuff in it, I've analyzed in episodes like A Day Without Tears and SpongeBob's Last Stand. But I guess at the end of the day, it'll be enough to entertain your kids for 11 minutes, so there's that. But once again, it's just another forgetful episode from a draining season.
There I was, walking along, just minding my own business, and then, boom! Some dumbbell put this thing in the way.
Well, let's finally end this video with the last episode. Now, keep in mind, the last two episodes I ended my last two seasonal reviews with, both got zeros. Not exactly a trend you want for your season, but we already broke one trend by starting with the great episode, so let's break this trend with... Okay, technically the trend is broken, because this episode by no means deserves a zero, so there's that. But it's still bad. Trench Billies is about SpongeBob and Patrick ending up at the bottom of a trench, where, well, very handsome bottom feeders reside. And they get to see how the bottom feeders live. Now, if you watched my second top 10 worst SpongeBob episodes video, you already know how I feel about this episode. That being said, since it is technically a special, I cheated by putting it on that list. I apologize, I swear, I didn't know it was supposed to be a special. But still, I did talk about it already, and not exactly in great details either, because all the problems with this episode are all right there in the open. The designs are disgusting, the atmosphere is very uncomfortable, and even if you don't find it unsettling, I can't see how you'd find it that entertaining. I guess by comparison though, the designs aren't as disgusting as the hagfish, and I do get why they're designed this way, but they don't do anything here. It's just nothing but a bunch of generic redneck stereotyping. None of the jokes are that original, the choices they make are just ridiculous, and even if you can look past the 11 minutes of gross designs and uncomfortable portrayals, there's really nothing in it that will leave you itching to rewatch it. A bottom-dwelling episode in a bottom-dwelling season. Well, that's 30 episodes down, 20 more to go. And then I'll be done with Season 7 for good. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next review.